So I'm about 15 years late to the iceberg trend list, but I don't really care. Plus, as of making this video, people are still actively making these, so I wanted to. So in case you've been living under a rock and don't know how iceberg tier lists work, essentially they are lists of information about a piece of media that goes in descending order from least to most obscure or least to most creepy. Because the Indiana Jones franchise doesn't have any, like, really truly fun, like, weird lost media or anything, this is mostly ranked in order from least to most obscure, but I did factor in how creepy it might be, just to sort of tie that in.
I have recorded this editing in my bit 4 or 5 times now. I've never been satisfied with what I've said, or I moved my head weird and it just looked bad. Anyway, they've announced casting for Indiana Jones 5. I think it's Phoebe Waller-Bridge, Mads Mikkelsen, and somebody else, and probably before I finish editing this, they're gonna announce somebody else. Honestly, them announcing the cast doesn't really change anything on the iceberg, as far as I can think of, and it's also entirely possible that it could get pushed back yet again, because while thankfully a lot of people are getting vaccinated and things seem to be winding down, it is entirely possible that something could happen and production could either get shut down for a couple of weeks after it starts or get pushed back to a later date.
Y'all, I hate it when I'm right.
So it's entirely possible that this movie still may not get made. Who knows? Point number 2, I made this iceberg, I forgot to mention it. I did this is all me. Credit only to me, and definitely not to the, like, 1,300 listicles that I cited in the description. So anyway, that's it. Thank you for watching. Enjoy the rest of the video.
So let's dive into the Indiana Jones iceberg. Marion Ravenwood's age. When you heard the line, "I was a child, it was wrong and you knew it," in Raiders for the first time, if you were like me, you assumed that she meant she was somewhere between 18 and 20, probably too young for Indy, but still an adult. However, it's implied in the script that Marion was actually as young as 15 when they first had a romance, while Indiana was 27. Yeah, this has been retconned, but if the math is correct, she would have only been about 17 after the retcon. If Marion becomes a more central character throughout the rest of the franchise, I wouldn't be surprised to see her aged up again. Vic Armstrong was the stunt coordinator and main stunt double for Harrison Ford throughout the first 3 Indiana Jones films. He also doubled for Harrison on other projects like Star Wars and Blade Runner up until the early 90s. The main reason he's on here, though, is because when they were younger, he and Harrison bore such a striking resemblance to each other that people would often get them mixed up on set, especially from behind. This would actually end up working in Lucasfilm's favor later on, but we'll get into that later. Indiana was named after George Lucas's dog. While Indiana canonically took his name from his fictional dog, he was actually named after George Lucas's real-life Alaskan Malamute, Indiana. The real-life Indiana also served as inspiration for Chewbacca, as the dog would often ride around in Lucas's passenger seat and people would mistake him for a person. Other characters who got their names from crew members' dogs include Willie Scott, who was named after Spielberg's dog, and Short Round, who was named after the Temple of Doom's rider's dog. Temple of Doom created the PG-13 rating. Prior to 1984, there was no MPAA rating between PG and R, meaning that a PG rating was a lot more like a PG-13 rating than it is now. However, Temple of Doom ended up being so frightening compared to other PG-rated films in that time period that complaints resulted in the creation of the PG-13 rating. Tom Selleck's Indiana Jones. While he's synonymous with the character now, Harrison Ford never actually auditioned for the role of Indiana Jones. Like with Star Wars, George Lucas only wanted to see talent he'd never worked with before. They eventually landed on Tom Selleck for the role of Indiana, but Selleck was unable to actually sign on for the film due to scheduling conflicts with the upcoming CBS show Magnum P.I. They ended up casting Harrison last minute after Spielberg saw a cut of Harrison as Han Solo in The Empire Strikes Back. So, just like with Star Wars, Harrison ended up working with George Lucas again, even though Lucas didn't want to. Ironically enough, filming for Magnum PI was pushed back about 6 months, meaning that Selleck could have actually played Indiana Jones. Harrison Ford's on-set injuries. Harrison has had several infamous on-set injuries. On the set of Raiders, he tore his right ACL during a fight scene, as well as getting horrifically sick while filming in Tunisia. On the set of Temple of Doom, he injured his back while riding an elephant and had to be sent back to the United States for an experimental surgery that put him out of commission for 6 weeks. However, our boy Vic Armstrong was able to fill in for Harrison for several scenes, so production didn't have to be shut down, with the scenes where you can actually see Indiana's face being filmed later. So, in most of the fight scenes in Temple of Doom, if you can't actually see Harrison Ford's face, it's likely that the actor on screen is actually Vic Armstrong. Dysentery on the set of Raiders. Like I mentioned earlier, Harrison got horrifically sick on the set of Raiders. In fact, everyone except for Steven Spielberg actually ended up getting dysentery because Spielberg only ate canned foods that he brought over from the UK. Anyways, the reason this is important is because it caused one of the film's most iconic scenes to be improvised. Due to Harrison being so sick, he was attempting to figure out how to get out of doing a huge sword fight with the swordsman in black. He approached Spielberg, said, "Can I just shoot the son of a bitch?" And then it became one of the most iconic moments in the film. Indiana will lose an eye in Indiana Jones 5. This is the first of several fan theories revolving around the upcoming 5th Indiana Jones movie. The Young Indiana Jones Chronicles series featured a then modern-day, early 90s, Indiana who sported an eye patch. While whether or not certain elements of pre-Disney buyout canon are actually still canon remains to be seen, and they did throw out elements of canon as early as Crystal Skull, it would be an interesting nod to the old canon if Indiana did actually lose an eye in the movie. It would also potentially put Indy out of commission without killing him, which I would prefer if we were going to get a spin-off where he passes the torch to someone else. Indy survives Kingdom of the Crystal Skull because of the Grail. This fan theory speculates that the reason Indiana survives the nuclear blast at the beginning of Crystal Skull is because he drank from the Holy Grail. There are 2 versions of this theory, one where Indiana is immortal, and another where the Grail just gives whoever drinks it a sort of video game 1-up kind of deal. Anti-aging technology. Some fans have speculated that the reason Indiana Jones 5 keeps being pushed back is because Lucasfilm is attempting to perfect anti-aging technology that they can use to make Harrison Ford look younger so they can set the film before Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. I actually put this on the iceberg before the final episode of Mando Season 2 came out, which actually gives this theory some credence. And while I'm happy that they let Mark Hamill play an actually decent version of Luke Skywalker, if that's the best deepfake Disney can do at the moment, I get why it keeps getting pushed back. That being said, the anti-aging on Samuel L. Jackson in Captain Marvel looked great, although black don't crack, and I've seen better deepfakes from amateurs online, so I'm not sure why Lucasfilm seems to have such a hard time with it. Dan Aykroyd in Temple of Doom. Dan Aykroyd has a small cameo in Temple of Doom as a British Army officer who helps Willie Short Round and Indiana leave Shanghai. George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, and Kathleen Kennedy also make cameos in this scene as missionaries. The Carbonite Theory. This theory states that the entire Indiana Jones series actually takes place in Han's carbonite stasis between Empire and Return of the Jedi. This explains why there are so many Star Wars references in Indiana Jones, like Club Obi-Wan, or these hieroglyphics that look like R2-D2 and C-3PO. It's probably more likely that they made these references because George Lucas made both of them, but whatever. Indiana Jones is a divine witness. Back when the height of media criticism was needlessly nitpicking movies that are perfectly enjoyable and functional until they made absolutely no sense, the Big Bazinga Theory had an entire episode dedicated to just how useless Indiana Jones was in the events of Raiders of the Lost Ark. I have not seen this episode and I refuse to watch it. Anyways, this theory is meant to be a counterpoint to the Indy is useless theory by claiming that Indiana had to bear witness to these events because some divine force has chosen him to witness them or whatever. Honestly, I just think that it's fine that a plot-driven movie is driven by the plot instead of by the actions of the characters. Indiana knew about aliens before Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. This theory suggests that Indiana knew about aliens prior to Crystal Skull, hence why he's called in to investigate the events of the film. It also explains why Indiana's not particularly shocked by the existence of aliens, although he has always been pretty unflappable about this kind of stuff, so it could just be his personality type. Temple of Doom is a metaphor for heartbreak. As has been previously established, Temple of Doom has a distinctly darker tone compared to the other Indiana Jones films, and while the franchise has always had a rocky relationship with how it portrays its female characters, Temple of Doom is one of the worst in terms of misogynistic overtones. And this likely isn't by mistake, even if it wasn't totally on purpose. Both Spielberg and Lucas were going through divorces at the time of making the film, and you can tell in the way Willie Scott is vilified for, quite frankly, acting the way any normal person would if they were dragged into an Indiana Jones film. There's also the whole ripping out a flaming, still beating heart thing, which is a little on the nose, but not at all surprising. Lucas has actually admitted to his life difficulties affecting the tone of the film, so this theory actually does have some credence. Indiana Smith. When George Lucas pitched the idea of Indiana Jones to Steven Spielberg, the character's original name was Indiana Smith. Spielberg felt the name Smith was too generic, so they eventually settled on Jones instead. The Ark of the Covenant at Galaxy's Edge. This is one of the coolest Easter eggs that used to be at Galaxy's Edge. From what I could tell, the Ark could be found in both Disneyland and Disney World in Doc Onder's Den of Antiquities, hiding up in the rafters. However, the Ark was later removed. I assumed it was because people were clogging up traffic in a fairly small shop, but according to this tweet, it was because fans complained about the colliding universes. Honestly, if you take the sanctity of canon so seriously that you actually take time out of your day to complain to underpaid Disney Park staff members about this kind of stuff, you deserve to be banned from the Disney parks for life. Into the Great Unknown. Into the Great Unknown is a comic from 2004 wherein Han, Solo, and Chewbacca crash land the Millennium Falcon on Earth in the early 19th century. After a conflict with the indigenous people of the Pacific Northwest, Han is fatally wounded, leaving Chewie stranded alone on Earth where he essentially becomes Bigfoot. 100 years later, Indiana and a young adult Short Round investigate the myths and stumble across the Falcon along with Han's skeletal remains. The two give up on the search, allowing Chewbacca to become part of the Great Unknown. This comic is obviously not canonical, but it was the first time Indiana and Han were shown together in an official Lucasfilm release. The title is a reference to the line from Temple of Doom.
Into the great unknown mystery. I go first, Indy.
Abner Ravenwood in Last Crusade. Apparently, Marion's father, Abner, was meant to be the man who gives Indiana the fedora. In fact, it was explicitly stated in earlier scripts, but was eventually dropped for the final product. This would explain why Indiana was so keen to hang on to the look. Rather than adopting it from a random stranger, it was from a man he ended up having a fairly close connection with. Kingdom of the Crystal Skull cut dialogue. According to a video by Justin Wang, there was a slightly different original cut of Crystal Skull that was only viewed by audiences on opening weekend. At the very end of the film, when Mutt picks up Indiana's hat, Indy took the hat and stated, "In your dreams, kid." However, viewers who saw the film after opening weekend remembered there being no dialogue at the end of the film, which is the way you can still see Crystal Skull to this day. Several people claim to remember seeing this alternate version of the film, and while there is some evidence that this line did exist, whether or not the line was actually in the film will remain unknown unless a bootleg version of the film from opening weekend surfaces. I recommend checking out the original video. He goes more in depth about the potential lost media than I can here. MCU Indiana Jones Shared Universe. This theory is tied to a throwaway line from the first Captain America movie about how Hitler digs for trinkets in the desert. While this is a fun concept, and I love the idea of Cap and Indy punching Nazis together, I think this theorist didn't realize that Hitler's search for supernatural artifacts was actually something the Nazi Party did during World War II. This also brings into question how the MCU's universe works. Star Wars 100% canonically exists in the MCU, so is Indiana Jones a thing, and also a biopic in the MCU if this is the case? Is Harrison Ford in both films, and they just got really lucky to find a dude who looks nearly identical to the real Indiana? Head full, many thoughts. Temple of Doom prank footage. During the filming of Temple of Doom, Spielberg pulled a prank on Harrison Ford that quite honestly feels like something out of a fever dream. There is video footage, which I'll show at the end of this bit, but it's extremely low quality and hard to decipher, so I'll describe it to you beforehand. Basically, in the scene where Indiana is chained up, instead of one of the guards torturing him, Barbara Streisand shows up dressed as a dominatrix and starts berating Harrison Ford for both making bad movies and being financially successful. Then Carrie Fisher shows up to rescue him and essentially reenacts the scene from Return of the Jedi where Han is unfrozen. Then Irvin Kershner shows up and starts berating Spielberg for how badly he's running his set. I'll go ahead and play it here. Thanks to David's Movie Corner on YouTube for both the re-upload and the footage, as well as the subtitles. Indiana is dead. Full disclosure, I hate these types of theories. They all reek of just wanting to be edgy. Anyways, this theory explains how Indiana survived the nuclear blast by saying that he didn't, and the entirety of Crystal Skull is his dying dream where he reunites with the only woman he ever loved and finds out they had a child together. I don't know why he would dream up Mutt as the ideal dream son, but like, go off, I guess. With Indiana Jones 5 coming out and James Mangold implying that it's set after Crystal Skull in the 1960s, yeah, this one's even stupider than it was beforehand. Locked Kingdom of the Crystal Skull theatrical reels. When Crystal Skull was released, Lucasfilm was so concerned that eager theater employees would end up leaking the film that they sent out the reels in locked boxes, and theaters were only given the code to open the boxes on the day that the film released. Indiana caused the events of Raiders. Another counter-argument to the Indy is useless critique, and big air quotes around critique there, is the theory that's less theory and more analysis of the plot, is that the Nazis would have never even found the Ark without Indiana. After all, the Nazis were digging in the wrong place, so Indiana is the one who inadvertently led them to where it was buried, and because they never would have found the Ark, they never would have been killed either. This puts Indiana in a far more proactive role, and it makes sense considering that the evidence is from the film itself.
Unreleased deleted scenes.
With the rise of home media like DVD, Blu-ray, and streaming, it's not hard to find behind-the-scenes content for most films and TV shows. However, Indiana Jones's cut scenes and bloopers have remained widely unreleased, usually only showing up mixed in with interviews and in documentaries, but almost never on their own. Yesterworld has a great video on this topic, along with Star Wars, although Star Wars has seen far more periodic releases of its behind-the-scenes and cut content. Who knows, with the 40th anniversary of Raiders coming up, we might actually get some of that content released, especially if there's some kind of limited edition box set once the 5th movie comes out that will sort of complete the series.
So because I am extremely good at editing things in a timely manner, they have announced that there is going to be a 40th anniversary release. I believe it already came out. I believe it came out on June 8th. So if you are interested in that, that is a thing that is now available to you.
Indiana's dead sister. While I could fill this list almost solely with tidbits from the expanded universe, such as Indiana's deceased first wife, the one I find most interesting is Indiana's deceased sister Susie, who passed away at a young age. This actually explains a lot about Henry Sr.'s behaviors, especially after losing his wife as well. The lost R-rated cut of Raiders. Prior to its release, several scenes were either cut or censored from the original cut of Raiders of the Lost Ark. The scene that was altered was the head explosion scene after the Ark of the Covenant was opened, and while the scene has never been released, uncensored screenshots are available. The R-rated cut also had several cut scenes, including an alternate version of the bar scene, a scene where Indiana is shown riding the Nazi submarine periscope, and several longer versions of scenes that are from the final film. As has been established, cut material from these movies is often incredibly hard to come by, so it's unlikely that this cut of the film will ever see the light of day, if it even still exists. The Society of Explorers and Adventurers. This is kind of a long one, so hang with me. This is also just a very small part of a much larger Disney theme parks expanded universe, so if you're interested in learning more about that, I highly recommend you go and check out Offhand Disney's series on the Society of Explorers and Adventurers, which I'm just going to call C from here on out because it's kind of a mouthful. Anyways, C is a group of characters created for the Disney theme parks, predominantly overseas, but they have been making some appearances in the US parks recently. Essentially, they're a group of adventurers and explorers who meet up to discuss new findings and treasures. The way Indiana Jones ties into this is through Jock Lindsay's Hangar Bar in Disney Springs, where C is referenced in its background story. There's even a direct name drop of the character in an in-universe newspaper clipping. Whether or not this will carry into the movies and potential spin-offs remains to be seen, but I think it's a fun idea. The Ark contains Sith ghosts. Basically what it says on the tin. Honestly, these kinds of Star Wars and Indiana Jones shared universe theories are kind of annoying. Indiana Jones and Star Wars share a universe. Considering all of the references the two films share, even though again it's just because they share quite a few cast and crew members, several fans have speculated that Star Wars and Indiana Jones take place in the same universe. I don't want to be a fun sucker, but I really don't think this theory adds much to either franchise. The only noteworthy thing is that E.T. also gets tied into this, as E.T. has a cameo in the prequels, and both E.T. and Indiana Jones were directed by Steven Spielberg. Also, Harrison Ford had a cut cameo in E.T., wherein he gave the little boy character a lecture about drugs while probably high as a kite himself.
And I see the pot, the pills, the angel wings.
But that does lead us into the Spielberg-verse. The Spielberg-verse is a theoretical shared universe among several movies directed by Steven Spielberg. The main crux is that aliens have consistently communicated with Earthlings, creating the indigenous societies seen in Crystal Skull that have access to teachings and technologies beyond their time, and that technology shows up across various Spielberg films. E.T.'s alien race is also important to this theory, as well as the tripods from War of the Worlds, but it gets kinda off in the weeds with the stuff about Jaws. It's a long read that I honestly mostly skimmed because almost all of these everything is in the same timeline theories feel like just really bad ripoffs of the Pixar theory or the MCU. I'll link more info in the description if you're interested though. But to sum it up, here's user Elephant Eric's TLDR. The Spielberg-verse and the various movies in it are a result of alien interference. Jurassic Park uses alien technology found in alien artifacts, Indiana Jones. Jaws is the result of this. E.T. saves the Earth from tripod aliens, and we have the Close Encounters aliens to thank for outing us to other alien races. Indiana Jones and the City of the Gods. While the script for the fourth Indiana Jones film would ultimately be written by David Koepp, several other writers created potential scripts for the film, including M. Night Shyamalan and Frank Darabont. Darabont's script, Indiana Jones and the City of the Gods, is actually available online to read currently. The plot of City of the Gods has some similarities to the final Crystal Skull script, namely the maligned fridge scene. However, it bears some striking differences, including the omission of Mutt giving Marion a still-living husband and actually introducing Nazis back into the story. It's kind of interesting to look at, and I highly recommend checking it out if you haven't, if only to read through the summary on the fan wiki. Belloc has a child. While what is and isn't considered canon has been up in the air since before Crystal Skull came out, there's actually quite a bit of obscure expanded universe reading material for Indiana Jones that's actually really interesting. One of the many books released in the wake of Crystal Skull was The Greatest Adventures of Indiana Jones, which is a coffee table book that essentially recounts the events of the first three films, but from the perspective of Belloc and his child. Other than on the back of the book, the child is never given a gender and is never given a name at all, and while they are obsessed with Indiana due to his ties to their father, they aren't given much in the way of thoughtful characterization, mostly due to the fact that the book has to maintain some accuracy to the film's original plots. so they can't go buck wild and have it be full of misinformation from the perspective of the antagonist or anything. Considering this child character is barely a character, it's interesting to wonder whether or not Lucasfilm had plans for Bellic's child following Crystal Skull. It would be interesting to see them show up in Indiana Jones 5, or potentially a spin-off. Again, though, this would require the book to remain canon, though, so it's up in the air about whether or not this actually means anything. I'll link a more in-depth post about the book in the description. The Indiana Jones Conspiracy. Full disclosure, I just googled Indiana Jones conspiracy theory and this is what came up, but it's too weird and borderline deranged to not include. Basically, some dude in 2008 was super disappointed by Crystal Skull and Da Vinci coded the film. Here's a dramatic reading of some of my favorite parts. The Indiana Jones character Lucas created is obviously based on himself. Everyone assumes he's just a bookish dweeb, but secretly he's an intrepid and dynamic adventurer who has spent his career plundering the riches of antiquity, i.e. biblical myths, old samurai movies. Marion Ravenwood, Karen Allen, is a cipher for Spielberg. She and Indy were close once, but parted ways. And while he was off on his crazy adventures, the Star Wars sequels, she was left to take care of the serious stuff, like Schindler's List and Munich. The Crystal Skull itself represents the dark art of blockbuster movie making. Think about it, it's an empty head. A not-so-veiled metaphor for the brainlessness of big-budget event movies. Indy finds it in a graveyard, symbolizing the death of the imagination, and journeys to bring it to a fabled city of gold, i.e. Hollywood, where it will sit in its rightful place along 12 similarly transparent crania. The other studio bosses. Kate Blanchett's baddie Irina Spalko obviously represents the forces of European art house cinema. She's smart, highly skilled, and she's Russian! They might as well have called her Ingmar Tarkovsky. Come to think of it, Irina Spalko sounds suspiciously like a name I refuse to Google or learn how to pronounce. I'm gonna be real with you. Like any good art house director, Spalko's ultimate goal is knowledge, not riches. She is therefore the enemy. Spalko is accompanied by an army of faceless, ineffectual foot soldiers, also known as movie critics. They fire zillions of bullets at Indiana, but never seem to do any damage. If any of them should fall off a cliff, or get eaten by ants, or suffer some similar misfortune, nobody really gives a damn. Of course, Indy/Lucas and co. succeed in their mission to reach Hollywood's top table and usher in a new era of dumbness. Evil Spalko's quest for knowledge gets her exploded. Chaos reigns, special effects go crazy, and with their tracks covered, the Crystal Skulls ones retreat to another dimension, probably a ranch in Montana. Not like George Lucas and Steven Spielberg weren't already at the top table. Future generations will be left to wonder why our civilization expended so much energy making such extravagant works of art, and why we worshipped idols of computer-enhanced action franchise cinema while society crumbled. But my discovery of the Peckham Scrolls will unlock these secrets and blow the whole conspiracy open. As a precaution, I have sent these artifacts to the US authorities, who assure me they are keeping them safe in a wooden crate in a gigantic warehouse somewhere. It should be blatantly apparent that this is, like, a joke. But it's just up its own ass enough to give me heartburn. Like, seriously though, why are we making bad art in the middle of a recession is just a bad precursor to John Mulaney's gazebo bit.
Building a gazebo during the Civil War would be like doing stand-up comedy now.
Congratulations, Steve Rose of The Guardian, you're managing to give me psychic damage 13 years into the future. Indiana allowed Hitler to live. This theory suggests that because Indiana and Bellic had their pissing contest, the Ark never made it to Hitler and therefore allowed him to survive. While I can't find a direct link to the quote, I recall Spielberg himself saying that this is not the case, and that Hitler would have been too savvy to open the Ark, so he would have just ended up with one of the most powerful weapons in human history. Which makes sense enough to me. Indiana Jones 5 is delayed until Harrison Ford retires or dies. I don't think this is an actually serious theory, but I have seen some speculation surrounding it. Basically, some people think that Indiana Jones 5 will never actually be made because Lucasfilm or some higher-ups at Disney don't actually want an Indiana Jones sequel, but they can't reboot it as long as Harrison Ford is still acting and willing to be in an Indiana Jones project. So they're going to keep delaying the project until Harrison either retires or dies. This is obviously completely false, considering A, the people who work at Lucasfilm aren't heartless. I don't think they're praying for a nearly 80-year-old silver screen icon's downfall just so they can make a quick buck. And B, do you know how bad the optics on that would look? Like, they would have to wait at least 5 years before they even announced a remake, if not longer. I just think they're afraid of getting the same reception that they got to Crystal Skull and, quite frankly, at this point, the sequel trilogy, so they're taking their time and being extra careful with it. And honestly, I respect that.
Also, Harrison hurting himself again notwithstanding. We do have footage. They have obviously begun production on the film. And I think they're continuing production with stuff that they can shoot without Harrison, although who knows how long they'll be set back. But I think it's pretty obvious at this point that this bullet point on the iceberg was more of just like a running, horrifically dark joke within the fan base than anything else.
Also, COVID. I'm so ready to live in press-attended times, you guys. Snake orgies. And now for a complete tonal shift. This is based off of a post I saw talking about how when snakes make, they do it in a giant orgy pit, which means that the Well of Souls was literally just a giant snake sex party. Have fun knowing that the next time you watch Raiders. Indiana Jones multiverse theory. This theory states that the space between spaces is actually an alternate dimension, meaning that there are multiple universes within the Indiana Jones franchise itself. There's also speculation that Star Wars takes place within one of these alternate universes. Aliens caused everything. According to this theory, the gods of the Indiana Jones universe are actually the Crystal Skull aliens. This explains why important religious artifacts from different religions, such as the Holy Grail and the Sankara stones, are both real and powerful, because the gods they're credited to are actually aliens. And that is the iceberg. Did I leave off a fun, cool fact that you know that you think should have been mentioned? Leave it in the comments. I never ask for engagement because I don't expect it. But if you enjoyed, like, subscribe, I don't know. I love you. Bye. From what I could tell, the Ark could be found in both Disneyland and Disney World in Doc Ondar's Dick of Antiquities. That's a very, very different store. Hey, Disneyland used to have a bra shop, so